You grow to measure your days by the weight of silence and the ticking of old machinery when you're stationed this far north. A brittle outpost at the edge of mapped territory, the kind of place the world forgets but where the wind never does. It was my 4th rotation at Sable Point Monitoring Station, a prefabricated structure crouched among a sprawling tundra that stretched out in every direction. The kind of cold that doesn't sting so much as it presses in and fills every hollow inside your body, until even your breath feels like it belongs to the snow. I'd come here, I told myself, for the quiet. There's no traffic, no city noise, not even the drone of distant aircraft, just the endless white plains, the sky like an old bruise, and the sound of the generator humming and coughing in its pen out back. The only other voices were those that lived inside the radio, engineers from Central checking in with their code words. The technician I replaced every 90 days, and, more than anything, my own thoughts echoing back at me in the empty halls. The layout of the station was a thing I'd memorized by necessity, not choice. Main entry at the west, loading dock at the south, a storage lock on the east wall that always jammed in the cold, and a windowless bulkhead on the northernmost side where the wall met the frost in a line so perfect it sometimes looked drawn with a ruler. No one ever used the northern sector for anything except storage overflow. The blueprints said there was no entrance or exit there, just reinforced steel, the same as the rest of the outpost, blank and unbroken save for a faded stenciled N that the last maintenance crew had labeled for reference. I'd checked it a dozen times myself in those first weeks, looking for drafts, leaks, or some forgotten panel that might explain the faint whistling I sometimes heard after dark. There was nothing, only wall, rivets, and cold. Nights were the hardest part. The sun dipped below the horizon for months at a time here, and after a while, the absence of light carved you out from the inside, leaving you with a different sense of time, one that seemed to drift or curl in on itself like smoke in a jar. I kept my routine like a talisman, generator checks at midnight, systems logs every 4 hours, meteorological readings, and the long, slow scan of the perimeter cameras that never showed anything but white static and the shapeless forms of snowdrifts pressed up against the fencing. The only real variable was the weather, and the weather didn't care if I lived or died. Most days, I felt like a shadow in my own life, repeating the same motions in the same narrow corridors. My boots squeaking on the linoleum, my gloved hands smudging the glass of the control room where the world beyond the window looked more like a painting than a place I actually inhabited. There was a comfort in the monotony, or so I thought. I suppose it's easier to be alone when you know precisely where everything is, when every angle of every room is mapped and measured, every door accounted for, and you can say with certainty that nothing will change unless you were the one to change it. It is a strange kind of arrogance, I guess, the belief that out here, at the far edge of everything, you are master of your small kingdom of routine and silence, a sentry at the end of the world with no one left to defend but yourself. Even the small, irrational fears, the way the pipes rattled when the wind shifted, the flicker of movement in the peripheral darkness just outside the sodium lamps seemed tame, familiar, nothing more than the ambient noise of solitude. Sometimes I would climb the observation tower after my shift and let the cold bite at my face, just to remember what feeling anything was like. The horizon was always the same, no matter how many times I scanned it, endless white, broken only by the crumpled spines of distant ridges and, on rare nights, the slow green ripple of auroras melting across the sky. I convinced myself that was enough, that isolation was a kind of freedom. The alternative was to admit I had come here to hide, though even I couldn't say what from. That winter, the storms were bad, worse than any I could remember. Snow piling up against the windows until the whole world beyond the glass felt buried. Drifts blocked the generator shed for 2 days, and I found myself rationing power more strictly, killing the light in unused wings, running diagnostics by flashlight when the main grid flickered. Radio traffic from Central grew thin, replaced by long stretches of static and the clipped, mechanical voice of the weather AI, repeating warnings I'd already memorized by heart. I checked the perimeter fence, more out of habit than hope, my boots sinking up to the calf in wet snow that seemed to drink in all sound. I would sometimes leave my own voice recordings, little notes to myself in the logbook, just to break the monotony of the system's synthetic churr. Sable Point Station, Day 47, status green. No anomalies detected. All entries secure. North Sector intact. The words echoed in the silent room, a ritual that felt at once pointless and comforting. There were no real threats here, not anymore. Just the cold, the wind, and the long, slow passage of uneventful hours, each one indistinguishable from the last. That's why I noticed when something felt out of place. It was a subtle thing at first, a shift in the background static, the sense that the station itself was holding its breath. I dismissed it as nerves, the product of too many nights alone with nothing but my own heartbeat and the hiss of the Radio 4 company. After all, I'd counted every door, every hatch, every panel that could possibly give, and I knew this place as well as the lines of my own hands. The north side was just a wall, always had been, always would be. But as the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, I caught myself checking the blueprints one more time, running my gloved hand over the cold steel of the northern bulkhead, tracing the faint outline of that old painted N, as if expecting it to tell me something new. Nothing changed. The world spun on in its endless white silence. But it was in that silence, beneath the hum of the old generator and the sigh of snow against the siding, that I first began to feel it, the subtle, steady presence of something waiting just out of sight, pressing up against the certainty of my routines, testing for a crack. I turned up the heater, refilled my coffee, and told myself it was nothing. Out here, nothing ever changed. Out here, there was no such thing as a north door. The rhythm of life at Sable Point Monitoring Station was a study in the subtle descent of order into monotony, a tapestry woven from repeated gestures and the dull repetition of protocol until the difference between days seemed to unravel altogether. 1 hour bleeding seamlessly into the next. The snow never stopped falling, not really. It just shifted in density, sometimes a drifting veil, sometimes a flurry so thick the world outside the thick plexiglass windows seemed to vanish in a living haze. The silence pressed in with particular force on the 49th night, a silence to perfect, broken only by the groan of settling beams and the distant, familiar pop of ice expanding somewhere deep within the structure's bones. It was after one of those sharp, organic cracks that I heard it a sound out of place, softer than the shriek of wind, more purposeful than the idle creaks of machinery. It was a drawn-out, shuddering groan, a low note that seemed to travel up from the floorboards and into the marrow of my legs. And it came from the direction of the north sector, that windowless expanse of reinforced steel that logic and blueprints assured me was only a wall. I froze, mug halfway to my lips, and waited for the noise to repeat itself. The heater kicked on, rattling through the ductwork like a train in a distant tunnel, but the other sound did not come again. It would have been easy, almost reflexive, to chalk it up to nerves, to blame the acoustics of a place designed to defy the elements and trick the senses. I made a mental note to check the paneling for warping in the morning and let my attention slide back to the endless, blinking string of diagnostics on the main console. I read over the security log, not really reading, just letting my eyes drift over the familiar line's main entry. Locked, loading dock, secured, storage, sealed, north sector, no entry. My own handwriting stared back at me, unwavering in its confidence. No entry, no door. I closed the logbook, shut down the monitor, and told myself that when you spend enough time in a place where every direction looks the same, your mind starts inventing cracks in the map just to keep itself occupied. Still, I found myself hesitating before shutting off the corridor lights, lingering at the intersection where the main hall forked off toward the north wall. The old N was still there, barely visible beneath the frost and layers of institutional paint, as meaningless and routine as everything else. Yet now it seemed to draw the eye in an unsettling way, demanding attention. I shook off the feeling and returned to my bunk, the rational part of my mind insisting that it was only fatigue, the product of too much coffee and not enough sleep. Even so, I woke twice that night to the sense of something out of alignment, a subtle pressure that made my skin prickle and my heartbeat quicken in the darkness. I checked the clock, watched the digits cycle past, and lay there listening to the wind scrape along the siding, waiting for another sound that never quite came. The next morning broke with a sky so overcast the line between night and day had nearly vanished. I forced myself through the motions. Generator check, comes test, a breakfast that tasted of cardboard and regret. But my thoughts kept circling back to the north sector. It was absurd. I reminded myself there was no door, had never been a door, not on that side, not according to the blueprints or the memory of every rotation I'd ever done at Sable Point. I pulled up the station schematics again, tracing the lines on my tablet with a finger grown numb from the cold. Main entrance, south lock, east utility, west supply. The north side was just a solid swath of hatchless steel, ribbed and reinforced, the last barrier between my small, flickering world and the endless, uncaring tundra beyond. The only reason anyone ever approached that side was to sweep out the snowdrifts that sometimes piled up against the foundation. I remembered doing it myself, shovel in hand, chipping at the hard-packed ice along the base of the wall and thinking, even then, how absolute it all seemed, how final. That day, as the light faded toward its usual twilight, I found myself standing in the main corridor again, staring down the narrow, institutional expanse that led to the northern bulkhead. My boots echoed against the tile, the sound oddly muffled by the drifts pressing in from outside. The air tasted faintly metallic, a byproduct of the station's perpetual half-life. And for a moment I thought I saw a darker shadow at the seam where wall met floor, a flicker of movement just outside the reach of the flickering overhead bulb. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the thick hush that followed every unexplained moment out here, a hush that felt almost alive. I pressed my palm to the steel, half expecting to feel warmth or vibration, some sign of mechanical failure or structural shift. But the metal was as unyielding as ever, cold, inert, the very definition of nothing. It should have ended there, with a shrug and a wry laugh at my own expense. But the sense of wrongness clung to me like the persistent chill that seeped in beneath the station doors. Throughout the day, I found myself glancing at the clock, waiting for the exact moment I'd heard that sound the night before, as if expecting some event to repeat itself on schedule. When it finally came a little after 2300 hours, according to the system log, I was sitting at the comms desk, logging weather data. This time, the noise was clearer, less ambiguous, a faint, dragging scuff, followed by the unmistakable click of a latch or bolt disengaging, the kind of sound that every technician learns to recognize within a week of living with industrial doors and their eccentric habits. I looked up, every nerve jangling, and felt an unreasonable surge of annoyance at my own reaction. There is no latch on the north wall, I told myself. There cannot be. The blueprints say so, the logs say so, and I say so. Still, I stood and walked the corridor in my slippers, bare toes curling against the cold, and once again found myself facing that blank expanse of steel. Only this time I saw it, a faint vertical seam, no wider than the blade of a knife, running from knee-height to eye level. So perfectly straight, I could almost believe it had always been there, hidden by layers of paint and routine. My breath fogged in front of me as I stared, the hair rising on the back of my neck. I reached out, half expecting my fingers to pass through nothing, but the metal was solid, unbroken, as implacable as ever. Still, the seam remained, a delicate incision in the world I thought I knew. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the sounds of the station heater kicking in, the fridge humming, the soft arrhythmic ticking of something against the window in the next room. I knew I should turn away, document the anomaly, call Central, do any of a dozen things that made sense. But the absurdity of it all rendered me motionless. How can a door appear where there is none? How can a wall you've trusted to keep out the world suddenly seem as permeable as a curtain? I pressed my forehead to the steel, the cold biting through my skin, and tried to recall every shift, every rotation, every time I'd walked these halls and sworn there was nothing here but wall and wind. Yet now there was a seam, and the possibility of a door, and a sound that would not be explained away. I told myself, firmly, that it was an illusion, a trick of light, an artifact of stress and exhaustion. I told myself, over and over, that there was no such thing as a north door. But that night, as I lay in my bunk, the words echoed hollow and thin in the darkness. Somewhere down the corridor, the silence pressed in, interrupted only by the memory of a latch clicking open where nothing should exist. And I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes, unwilling to let go of the absurd certainty that something on the north side of Sable Point Monitoring Station had shifted in a way that could not be mapped, measured, or explained. And so, with the snow still falling and the station groaning quietly around me, I waited, not sure what for, only that the world I thought I knew had developed a fault line, as delicate and dangerous as a seam in steel. The wind was a living thing that night, threading through the gaps in the siding and rattling the aluminum joints until the whole structure seemed to flex on its foundation, shuddering like a beast in uneasy sleep. I lay awake listening to the storm as it prowled around the eaves, the familiar chorus of whistling and groaning and the odd, resonant pop of ice pulling at metal. I had grown used to these nocturnes, their patterns as predictable as the heartbeat of the station itself, each one a comfort in its own way, proof that the world outside was still behaving according to the laws I understood, that nothing could breach the perimeter of steel and protocol I had built around myself. But that night, as the digital clock on my desk crawled its way past 3, a new sound began to thread its way through the harmony of weather and machinery, a sound that was at once utterly foreign and deeply, viscerally wrong. It started as a single, low creak, drawn out and deliberate, the kind of sound you might expect from the slow opening of an old door on rusted hinges, though nothing in the station was old enough or built of wood enough to make such a noise. It was different from the clicks and shudders of settling walls, sharper and more organic, as if the building itself had inhaled and held its breath. The sound came again, louder this time, and I found myself holding perfectly still beneath my blanket, pulse thumping in my throat as I tried to convince myself that I was only hearing things. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, shifting pipes, frost working its way into the seams, an animal nosing at the siding. Yet even as these excuses lined up in my head, I knew none of them fit. I listened, straining to place the origin of the noise, and found it was coming from the direction of the north wall, from that part of the station that had always been blank, impassable, featureless. The knowledge landed in my gut with a cold certainty. I waited for the sound to repeat, each second stretching out, marked only by the wind's muted growl and the soft hum of the heater, fighting back against the encroaching cold. Then it came, a distinct, unmistakable metallic scrape, the slow drag of something heavy moving across steel. I sat up, blinking in the dim blue glow of the emergency light, and held my breath as the sound repeated, closer this time, more deliberate. It was as if someone was sliding open a door, inch by inch, careful not to let it slam. I was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief, every sense trained on that impossible place where no door should be. I tried to reason with myself, to recall every schematic, every maintenance report, every walkthrough I'd ever performed. There was no door. There could not be a door. But the noise persisted, a slow, insistent creak that seemed to pulse in time with the erratic beating of my heart. The heater kicked off, plunging the room into a sudden, absolute quiet. In that silence, the noise was impossibly loud, echoing down the corridor, carrying with it the undeniable impression of intent. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, the floor icy against my bare feet, and crept to the door of my quarters. The station was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the comms panel and the blinking red LED of the generator monitor. The hallway stretched out before me, a narrow tunnel of shadow and cold. I moved slowly, listening, each step sending little jolts of static up my spine. When I reached the intersection near the north wall, I stopped. The air here was different, charged, as if the very molecules were vibrating at a frequency just below hearing. I pressed my palm to the steel cold, solid, unmoving, and listened, heart hammering in my chest. The sound had stopped. The silence was total, oppressive. I closed my eyes, willing myself to believe that it had been a trick of the wind, a glitch in the acoustics of this place, where even time felt unreliable. I waited, counting breaths, counting heartbeats, counting the seconds as they slid past in a slow, viscous crawl. Then, from just beyond the wall, came a soft, shuffling noise, like footsteps muffled by snow, followed by the unmistakable click of a latch. I jerked my hand away, stumbling back a step, staring at the place where I had earlier traced the seam with my finger. There was nothing visible, no change, only the same blank expanse of metal and the faded end stenciled above it. I wanted to run, to slam myself against the emergency hatch and flee into the night. But some stubborn, foolish part of me held firm. I was the only one here, the only living soul for miles, and if I lost control, there would be no one to bring me back. I forced myself to turn away, to walk back down the hall to the control room, each step an act of will against the terror clawing at my ribs. I sat at the console, staring at the grainy feed from the perimeter cameras, watching the snow swirl in endless, hypnotic loops. There was nothing out there, nothing on any of the monitors, nothing in the logs. The system reported all entries secure, no breaches, no anomalies. But I knew, with the same cold certainty that had gripped me in the corridor, that something had changed. The station felt smaller now, more claustrophobic, as if the walls were slowly drawing in. I tried to distract myself with routine, log entries, system checks, recalibrating the environmental sensors. My hands shook as I typed, the words coming out in staccato bursts. I forced myself to record a message for Central, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Unexplained noise, North Sector, 317. No visible entry, no breach detected. Will investigate further at first light. I listened to the playback, wincing at the hollowness in my tone, and filed it away with the rest of my notes. I did not sleep the rest of that night, lying awake in the half-dark, ears straining for any new sound. The creak did not return, nor did the scrape, nor the click of a phantom latch. Only the wind, tireless and uncaring, kept me company as the hours crawled by. I watched the shadows move across the ceiling, tracking their slow, inevitable progress as the night bled into morning. When the sun finally rose, if you could call the feeble grey light that seeped through the clouds a sunrise, I felt no relief, only a dull ache in my bones and a growing sense of unreality. I made coffee, forcing down each bitter swallow, and stared at the corridor that led to the north wall. It looked the same as ever, empty, cold, unremarkable. But I knew what I had heard, and no amount of routine could erase the memory. I told myself, again and again, that there was no door, that the sound had been nothing, that I was not losing my mind. Yet the certainty of it nagged at me, burrowing into the back of my thoughts, a splinter of unease that refused to be dislodged. I busied myself with chores, inventorying supplies, checking the generator, reviewing data logs. Anything to keep from walking back down that hall, to keep from pressing my hand once more against the cold, unyielding steel. But I knew I would have to face it, that I could not avoid the truth forever. As the day wore on, the memory of the sound grew sharper, more insistent. I replayed it in my head, dissecting every detail, every nuance, searching for some clue, some rational explanation. But there was none. The creak was a door's cry, the scrape a door's passage, the click a door's latch. But there was no door. There could not be. And yet, in the deep watches of the night, when the wind fell silent and the station seemed to breathe around me, I wondered, if there is no door, then what, exactly, had opened? When dawn finally broke, a term I use loosely, as sunrise here was little more than a thinning of darkness, a wan gradient of pewter and bone seeping across the eyes. My sense of reality had become slippery, stretched thin by too many hours spent staring at the walls, listening to the murmur of machinery and the whisper of things I could not see. I moved through my morning routine as if it were a form of penance, a hot mug pressed against my numb fingers, boots laced tight, thick jacket zipped to my chin, the soft chime of the comms panel offering up the same old static. Everything in the station looked as it always had, drab, utilitarian, comfortless, but beneath the surface. I sensed a tension, a coiling of the air itself, as though the building and I were both bracing for something unnamed. When the memory of the night's noises grew too sharp to ignore, I made the decision with the same grim resolve I used for generator checks in a blizzard, or for those unscheduled midnight perimeter sweeps that I always told myself were just good discipline and not the symptoms of a gnawing dread. Armed with little more than a flashlight, my maintenance log, and the brittle remains of my skepticism, I walked the length of the main corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The north sector was colder than the rest of the station, not by much, but enough for breath to condense in front of my face, thin wisps dissipating almost as soon as they appeared. I told myself it was a quirk of the insulation, an artifact of the wind's ceaseless assault on the north wall, nothing more. The steel bulkhead at the end of the corridor looked unchanged, dull, pitted, the faded N presiding over its featureless expanse like an accusation. Yet, as I approached, the unease in my gut sharpened, blossoming into a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. There was a smell in the air, faint but distinct, like old ozone and melting snow, not unpleasant, but not right either. I swept the beam of my flashlight over the wall, expecting to find the same blank metal as always. Instead, I saw the seam I'd glimpsed in the uncertain light of the night before, now more visible, a razor-straight line cutting down from the stenciled N to the floor. I leaned in, eyes narrowed, and ran my gloved fingers along the groove. The metal was colder here, almost painfully so, and as my hand traced the length of the seam, I realized with a kind of dreadful clarity that it was no illusion, no trick of light. This was a door. Or rather, it had become one. There was no handle, no visible hinges, nothing to mark it as an entryway except the precision of the gap itself and the subtle warping of the steel around the edges, as though some immense pressure had forced it outward from within. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat measured and loud in the hush of the corridor. For a moment, I simply stared, trying to reconcile what I knew, that there was no north door. Had never been a north door with what my senses insisted was true. The logs, the blueprints, the station schematics, all denied this possibility. But the evidence was before me, undeniable and solid. I pressed my palm flat against the center of the seam, feeling the ridges and imperfections in the metal, and pushed gently. The wall did not yield. I tried again, harder, and was met with the same immovable resistance. I stepped back, shining the flashlight along the floor, and saw that the snow near the base of the bulkhead was disturbed, brushed aside in a crescent, as though something had swept through from the other side. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end. A part of me wanted to retreat, to write this off as fatigue, to return to my duties and pretend that the North Sector was as innocuous as it had always been. But curiosity, or maybe fear, the two are twins in places like this, drove me on. I walked the perimeter inside, tapping gently at the walls, listening for hollows or changes in tone, the kind of old technician's trick meant to reveal secret passages or hidden faults. Nothing. The walls were solid, uncompromising, and yet the seam remained, visible now even in the diffuse grey light filtering through the corridor's single frosted window. I documented the anomaly in my log, taking a series of photographs with the station's battered digital camera, each flash revealing the same impossible geometry, a door that should not exist. I decided to inspect the outside of the station, reasoning that the north wall would be encased in ice, drifted high with snow, as it always was this time of year. I donned my parka, boots, and gloves, steeling myself for the wind's slap, and trudged out into the blinding white. The air outside was bitter, carrying with it the promise of storms still forming on the horizon. I made my way round the building, boots crunching through crusted drifts, breath ragged in my throat. The north side of the station loomed ahead, its surface sheathed in a thin veneer of ice. But there, right where the seam was, on the inside, I saw a shallow depression, as if the snow had been parted and then hastily filled in. The sense of intrusion was overwhelming. I brushed away the loose powder, exposing the same vertical line, the same impossible evidence that something had moved here, something with intention and direction. Returning inside, I paced the corridor, mind racing with questions I could not begin to answer. Had I missed something on earlier inspections? Had there been a flaw in the construction, an oversight no one had caught in years of rotations? Or had something changed, some fundamental aspect of reality quietly shifted while I slept? The more I tried to impose logic on the situation, the more it unraveled. The noise from the night before was now paired with physical proof. The door was real, or at least as real as anything else in this place. I wanted to call Central, to transmit the evidence, but even as I reached for the radio, I hesitated. What would I say? That a door had appeared where none should exist, that I had heard footsteps and latches, seen marks in the snow, felt the world slipping sideways beneath my feet. I could already imagine the response, a gentle suggestion to get more rest, a reminder of the isolation protocols, perhaps even a promise to send a replacement. None of it would address the reality in front of me. I spent the rest of the day in a state of restless agitation, unable to focus on my tasks, every thought circling back to the north door. I checked it again and again, half expecting it to vanish, to revert to a simple, solid wall, but it did not. If anything, The seam grew more pronounced as the hours passed, the light catching its edges in ways I could not ignore. I watched the snow outside for signs of movement, studied the security feeds, replayed the night's noises in my mind until they lost all sense of sequence. The station felt different now, subtly altered, as if the appearance of the door had introduced a new variable into the closed system of my life here. The routines I had relied on for comfort, coffee, logs, perimeter sweeps, became hollow gestures, inadequate in the face of this new, impossible truth. As night fell once more, I stood at the end of the corridor, staring at the north door, uncertain whether I wanted it to open or remain forever closed. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant, and for the first time since my arrival at Sable Point, I felt truly alone, not just in body, but in mind, unmoored from the certainties that had once defined the boundaries of my world. I wondered, as I turned away, if I was witnessing the beginning of some slow unraveling, a dissolution of logic and reason, or if I had simply crossed some invisible threshold into a reality shaped by fear and isolation. Either way, the door was real now, and nothing, not the logs, not the blueprints, not my own stubborn denial, could make it otherwise. Rationality is a fragile thing, a glass wall you only realize is there when you hear the first crack. For hours after discovering the North Door, a phrase that still felt impossible in my mind, I clung to procedure as if it might anchor me in the old reality. There had to be an explanation, something rooted in architecture, history, or even an administrative mistake. I began with the blueprints, poring over digital copies stored on the battered station laptop, tracing each wall and bulkhead with a trembling finger, searching for some overlooked annotation or an alternate version of the plans that might account for what I was seeing. I compared the files, squinting at the pale grid lines and engineering jargon, checking dates and signatures, the stamped approval from some forgotten committee back in a world where everything had an answer. But every document, every revision, every archived maintenance log denied the possibility of a North Door. The wall was solid, a dead end, a statement of fact repeated across every record and every memory. No one had ever authorized a change. No one had ever suggested a passageway. I read through the construction records for the site, hunting for reports of repairs or undocumented modifications, but found only the usual litany of complaints: frozen pipes, jammed locks, requests for better insulation, no mention of new doors. No hint that the architecture had ever been anything other than what I knew. I even went through the personnel logs, half hoping to find a record of some contractor or technician, a name I didn't recognize. Some brief notation of unauthorized work during a rotation I hadn't served. Nothing. The station's history was as consistent as it was dull. And yet now, at the edge of that history, stood a door that should not exist. Next, I tried to convince myself that what I'd found was a structural defect, a stress fracture in the metal, perhaps, or the result of some obscure process in the materials that made up the wall. I spent an hour with a flashlight and a wrench, tapping along the length of the seam, listening for changes in tone, the hollow rattle that would indicate weakness or rot. But the wall responded as it always had, dense, resonant, impossibly sturdy. I ran my fingers along the edges, searching for any sign of welding or repair. A patch of mismatched paint, a telltale bump or groove that would betray human intervention. The surface was as seamless as ever, save for that one ruler straight line, sharper and more defined in the weak light. I pressed against it, hard, but it did not yield. I tried to slide a credit card into the crack, but the gap was too narrow, too precise, as though the metal itself had been sliced and then almost but not quite sealed back together. My mind rebelled at the thought that something so perfect could be accidental, yet I could not conceive of how or why. Anyone would go to such lengths to construct a door only to erase all evidence of its existence. When logic failed me, I turned to memory, scouring the dim recesses of my mind for some moment when I might have overlooked the impossible. I tried to recall every previous rotation, every midnight walk through the corridor, every mundane moment when I had passed the north wall without a second glance. Had I missed something all those years? Or had the door truly appeared overnight, conjured from nothing by forces I could not name? I pulled out old photos from my first deployment, shots of the corridor taken out of boredom or for inventory, hoping to catch a glimpse of the seam, the faintest indication that it had always been there. But the images showed only blank steel, the stenciled N, a forgotten mop bucket, a coil of extension cord, nothing more. The past refused to yield any clues, and the present became more unreal with every minute. Desperation drove me to check the station's environmental controls, looking for leaks, temperature anomalies, anything that might suggest the wall had warped due to stress or frost heave. The readings were normal, the sensors reporting nothing out of the ordinary save for a minor drop in temperature near the north sector, something I'd already blamed on the insulation. I recalibrated the thermostats, ran a full diagnostic on the structural monitors, and watched the graphs crawl across the screen, hoping for an explanation that would restore order to my universe. But the numbers offered only more silence, another refusal to engage with the impossible. When I finally allowed myself to sit down and breathe, I considered the possibility that the answer lay not in the station, but in myself. Isolation does strange things to the mind. I knew this better than most, having endured the endless months of silence and repetition. The way the world outside the windows could blur and flatten into a single, unbroken field of white. I had read the manuals on psychological health, the warnings about sensory deprivation and hallucination, the slow, creeping madness that could erode the sharp edges of reason. Was it possible that the door existed only in my perception, a phantom conjured from loneliness and fear? I ran through the checklist for self-assessment, forcing myself to recall details from other parts of the station, to identify familiar objects, to repeat the protocols for reality testing. Everything else was as it should be, unchanged. Only the north wall defied logic. That afternoon, I made a recording for Central, careful to keep my tone calm, my language clinical. Unexplained structural anomaly detected in North Sector, requesting review of construction records and remote diagnostic scan. No immediate breach or hazard noted, but will continue monitoring. I sent the message and listened to the outgoing ping, half expecting the comms panel to spit back an error, or for the signal to dissolve into static. Instead, the confirmation tone rang out, ordinary and unimpressed by my crisis. I checked the camera feeds again, making note of the blankness outside the north wall, the way the snow drifted in swirling arcs as if concealing secrets. Nothing moved, no shadows, no figures, only the endless, silent white. In the hours that followed, I did my best to reassert the boundaries of my world. I swept the floors, inventoried supplies, ran the emergency drills I had practiced 100 times before. I cooked a bland meal, forced myself to eat it, made notes in the maintenance log. Yet all the while, I felt the presence of the door pressing at the edge of my vision, an itch I could not scratch. I caught myself glancing down the corridor, waiting for some further sign, a rattle of the latch, a drift of cold air, the echo of footsteps. None came, but the unease only deepened, growing heavier and more insistent as evening fell. Before bed, I returned to the north sector one last time, hoping to find that the door had vanished, that I would wake from this strange detour and find my reality intact. But it was still there, as undeniable as my own reflection, the seam a dark invitation in the half-light. I pressed my hand against the metal, closed my eyes, and tried to will it away. Tried to remember the corridor as it had always been, unbroken, ordinary, safe. But memory and wishful thinking are no match for what the senses insist is true. I withdrew, defeated, and returned to my quarters, locking the door behind me with a care that felt both childish and essential. That night, as I lay in the dark, the wind howling outside, I listened for the creak, the scrape, the click of an impossible latch. I told myself, again and again, that I was sane, that the world was rational, that there was always an explanation. But as the station settled into silence, the only sound was my own breathing, shallow and uncertain, and the echo of the impossible pressing at the edge of what I could understand. When the first desperate hope of explanation failed, there came a new hunger, raw and instinctive, for witness someone, anyone, who might see what I saw and say, "Yes, it is there, it is real. You have not lost yourself in the silence." I spent that morning drafting and redrafting a message for Central, abandoning all pretense of clinical distance, letting my words slip into the realm of the personal, the vulnerable, the strange. "Please advise," I wrote. "A door has appeared on the north wall. Schematics do not account for it. Request immediate contact. Please respond." I described the scene, the noises in the night, the marks in the snow. I told the truth as I knew it, that my reason was failing, and the station was changing in ways the blueprints could never predict. I sent the message, watching the blinking cursor, until the console spat out its usual confirmation tone, flat and indifferent to the terror in my voice. Then I waited. I filled the hours with menial work, triple-checking the environmental controls, reorganizing the supply closet, recalibrating the cameras that faced the blank drift beyond the north wall. Each task was a postponement, a way to keep my hands busy while my mind circled the prospect of a reply. Noon passed, then 2, then 5. In the past, Central's responses had never taken more than an hour, even on days when storms battered the satellites and the static all but drowned the world. But as the afternoon faded and the pale twilight began to bleed through the window, there was only silence. I checked the comms panel a dozen times, ran diagnostics, rebooted the antenna array. The logs showed my message had gone out clean, my signal receipt confirmed, but nothing came back. I was alone, and the world outside had never felt so far away. In my desperation, I dug through the station records for names, searching for anyone still posted on a nearby site, any technician who might be reachable by the emergency band. I broadcast my call sign, Sable Point North, on all local frequencies, cycling through every distress code I could remember, my voice shaking only a little as I recited the cold formalities of the protocols. "This is Sable Point Monitoring Station. If anyone is receiving this transmission, please respond. I am experiencing an anomaly in the north sector. Requesting confirmation of visual." I repeated the message every 15 minutes for 2 hours, voice growing hoarser with each repetition. The static answered me with its infinite patience, never wavering, never breaking, only a sea of emptiness where once there had been the comfort of distant voices. I began to doubt the very existence of the world outside my station. Had Central abandoned me? Had some storm or fault severed the links between me and every other outpost for miles? The satellite weather feeds, when they worked at all, still pulled grainy images of the endless white, storm patterns spiraling in slow, frozen violence over the Arctic Sea. The news ticker from months before, when there had still been news, looped its old warnings, advisories, and technical minutiae, everything dated and irrelevant to my immediate, gnawing need for contact. The isolation, always sharp at the best of times, now became a blade. Every sound in the station took on new meaning. The hum of the heater, the whine of the fridge, the tick and sigh of settling metal. I spoke to myself in the mirror, rehearsing explanations, testing my voice for tremors, convincing myself that I was still capable of calm, rational speech. At some point in that haze of loneliness and self-interrogation, I became convinced that the only possible witness was myself. If I was to hold on to any hope of understanding, I would have to become both observer and observed, scientist and subject, charting the impossible for whatever part of myself still believed in facts and records. I began documenting everything with feverish precision. I measured the seam of the door with a tape I found in the toolbox, recording the exact length and width, noting the temperature at 5-minute intervals. I took more photographs, adjusting the flash, the angle, the focus, always looking for some anomaly, some flaw in the record that would betray a trick of the light or a malfunction of memory. I even set up a portable camera on a tripod, programming it to take snapshots every 15 seconds throughout the night, hoping to capture whatever force was at work in the darkness. But as I catalogued, measured, and recorded, a subtler change began to take hold. The door no longer seemed content with its existence as an architectural anomaly. It began to feel like a presence, a node in the station's layout where space and logic bent inward, folding on themselves in silent invitation. I would catch myself standing at the end of the corridor, staring at it for minutes on end, unable to look away, the hair on my arms prickling, every instinct screaming for retreat. I told myself I was only curious, that I was simply gathering data, but the feeling grew in me that I was being watched not just by the door, but by something on the other side, something waiting for me to make the next move. The sense of being observed became oppressive. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision. Sometimes I thought I heard faint, shuffling sounds coming from the north sector, as if someone or something were pacing just beyond the steel. My dreams became turbulent, filled with images of endless corridors and vanishing walls. The door opening and closing on its own, revealing only darkness inside. I awoke more than once, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, certain I had heard my name whispered from the direction of the anomaly. I stopped sleeping in the bunk nearest the north sector, instead dragging my mattress into the control room, surrounded by the blinking lights and comforting noise of the comms equipment. But even here, the door exerted a kind of gravitational pull. I found myself drifting toward it, half awake, in the grey hours before dawn, driven by some compulsion I could neither resist nor explain. With each day that passed without response from Central or any other voice, my sense of unreality deepened. I reviewed the logs of previous rotations, looking for any cryptic remarks, any suggestion that others before me had seen or heard what I was experiencing. The logs were mundane, even cheerful in their monotony, jokes about the cold, complaints about the food, notes about generator failures and minor repairs. If anyone had ever noticed the door, they had left no record of it, or else the evidence had been erased, lost to the endless cycles of deletion and update that kept the bureaucracy running. It was as if my experience was unique, singular, a fissure opening only for me. By the end of the week, I had stopped expecting an answer. The world had narrowed to the dimensions of the station, and within it, the north door had become the silent center of everything. My attempts to reach out became ritual, performed less in hope than in defiance of the silence. Each time I keyed the mic, each time I scanned the frequencies, I was reminded of the profound indifference of the world beyond, an indifference that had acquired a new, threatening character since the door's appearance. I found myself wondering if perhaps the door was never meant to be seen, if its very existence depended on my isolation, my need for contact, my growing uncertainty. If someone else were here, I thought, would it still be real, or would it vanish, receding back into the architecture of madness from which it had come? On the 8th night, as the station creaked and groaned under the weight of another storm, I dreamed of a voice answering my call, faint and distorted, rising out of the static. "You are not alone." I woke, heart pounding, scrambling for the mic. But there was only the hiss of empty air, the flicker of the monitors casting restless shadows on the wall. The north door remained solid and inscrutable. It seemed sharper than ever in the glow of the emergency lights. And so I returned to my vigil, half hopeful, half dreading, caught in a loop of expectation and despair. My world shrinking to the length of the corridor, the size of a door that should not, could not, exist. Sleep, if it came at all, was a thin, feverish blanket pulled tight across the surface of my mind, never truly insulating me from the cold, or from the growing sense that the boundaries of my world were being redrawn in real time. The rhythms of station life, those old, reliable rituals of routine and order grew erratic, out of sync with the movement of the sunless days and nights. I would wake from dreams already uncertain whether I had slept at all, sometimes convinced I heard the faint, metallic creak of the north door sliding shut, only to find the corridor silent and still, the cold air lapping at my ankles in subtle eddies that whispered of intrusion. The logs I kept became a lifeline and a torment, their neat columns and timestamps tracking not only my actions but the growing fractures in my perception. I annotated everything. When I checked the door, the condition of the seam, the temperature near the wall, the strange currents in the air, the uneasy sense that the station's layout was no longer fixed but malleable, as if the rules of architecture themselves were being negotiated afresh each hour. At first, the changes were small. The seam in the metal would appear more pronounced in the half-light of dusk, then fade almost to invisibility by morning. On some days I found faint condensation or a thin film of frost along its length, as if the inside of the station was breathing out through an invisible crack. More than once I caught a flicker of movement at the threshold, a shadow that vanished as soon as I brought my eyes to bear on it directly. I convinced myself that fatigue was to blame, or perhaps the subtle rearrangement of air currents brought about by changes in the outside temperature. But even as I catalogued these fluctuations, the events began to escalate, no longer content to lurk at the edge of perception. One evening, as I completed my final systems check and prepared to seal off the unused wings for the night, I heard the unmistakable thud of metal shifting against metal, followed by the long, drawn-out whine of hinges or rollers. The sound echoed through the corridor, unmistakable in its deliberation. I dropped my clipboard, heart hammering, and moved toward the source, flashlight trembling in my grip. The north door stood open, no longer just a seam, but a narrow, unmistakable gap, a wedge of darkness that seemed to pulse and shimmer at the edge of vision. I stared, paralyzed, as cold air spilled into the corridor, thick with a scent I could not name: ozone, dust, something older and more mineral. My breath clouded in the sudden chill as I stepped forward, unable to resist the magnetic pull of the open space. I reached out, hand shaking, half expecting my fingers to pass through illusion. But the darkness was solid, viscous, impenetrable. For a moment I was sure I could see the faint outline of another corridor beyond, identical to my own, but wrong in subtle, vertiginous ways. The shadows moved in the wrong direction. The overhead lights flickered in a different rhythm. The walls seemed to tilt imperceptibly away from the laws of perspective. I retreated, stumbling over my own boots, and watched in numb horror as the door began to close, slowly, silently, as if guided by a will that was neither mechanical nor human. The seam reappeared, the line sealing itself as seamlessly as it had opened, leaving no mark or trace of its passage save for the residue of cold and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I logged the time, the temperature, the details of what I had seen. Though even as I wrote them down, the facts began to blur at the edges, melting into dream. I resolved to set up a camera, to catch the phenomenon on film, to prove to myself that it was real, that I was not unraveling into hallucination and dread. The next morning, the corridor was empty. The door, once again, nothing but a hairline seam in the steel. I played back the footage from the night before and found only darkness, the camera's field of vision obscured by sudden, inexplicable static for the crucial minute in which the door must have opened and closed. I rewound, advanced frame by frame, searching for a glitch, a shadow, a flicker of motion, nothing. The logs showed a brief interruption in power to the camera, a surge coinciding with the exact moment of the anomaly. Frustrated, I checked the rest of the station, searching for any sign of tampering or fault, but found nothing. It was as if the station itself was conspiring to erase the event, to fold it back into the fabric of monotony and denial. As days passed, the pattern repeated, each time with subtle variations designed to erode my confidence and sense of reality. Sometimes the door would open just a crack, the corridor beyond visible only for an instant before it vanished. Other times it remained shut for days, the seam all but invisible, tempting me to believe the nightmare had ended. I developed rituals to cope, checking the north wall at set intervals, marking its appearance and disappearance in the log, reciting the specifications of the corridor under my breath like a litany. I left objects near the door, coins, pens, a strip of colored tape, hoping to catch some sign of movement or tampering. Sometimes the objects vanished, only to reappear hours later in impossible places. A pen in the galley sink, a coin embedded in the frozen drift outside the main entrance. I tried to convince myself that I was moving them in my sleep, that the routines of isolation were finally wearing through the fabric of my reason. But the coincidences became too precise, too loaded with meaning to ignore. Worse still, the door began to manifest at different times, in different ways. Once, as I walked the south corridor to check the environmental controls, I found a thin line etched into the wall, identical in every detail to the seam of the north door, though no such feature had ever existed there. I pressed my hand to the metal, felt a chill run up my arm, and jerked away, blinking as the seam faded before my eyes, leaving only smooth steel behind. Another time, while dozing at the comms panel, I woke to the sound of distant footsteps echoing from the east storage lock, the cadence unmistakably human, though I was alone in the station. When I reached the site, the air was thick with cold, and the faintest outline of a door lingered in the frost before vanishing under my gaze. These manifestations grew more frequent as my isolation deepened. I would find myself disoriented, uncertain which part of the station I was in, turning corners to find familiar corridors subtly altered, the angles wrong, the lighting shifted, the sense of space unreliable. The door would reappear, a phantom seam in walls that should have been unbroken. Each time it appeared, the sense of dread intensified, a silent warning etched into the architecture of my refuge. Yet, despite my fear, I could not resist the urge to approach, to document, to witness. The door had become an obsession, the fixed point around which my shrinking universe revolved. Whether it was a message, a malfunction, or a madness unique to me, I could no longer tell. All I knew was that my world was no longer bounded by logic or memory, and that whatever force had brought the north door into being was not content to remain hidden. It wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be recorded in the logbooks and rituals of a man marooned at the end of the world. And as the door continued to open and close, sometimes silently, sometimes with the grinding protest of old machinery, understood, at last, that my role had changed. I was no longer simply the caretaker of this lonely station. I had become the witness to a phenomenon that would not be denied, no matter how many times I blinked, rationalized, or pleaded with the silence. The north door was real, and it would not let me forget it. I began to dread the silence, not for what it withheld, but for what it suggested was listening. Days blurred into nights, and nights dissolved into a kind of grey insomnia. My mind gnawed hollow by the certainty that I was not alone in the station, or, if I was, then alone only in the most technical sense. There is a quality to some silences awaiting, a pressure, as if the world itself has taken a breath and is holding it, watching to see what you will do next. This was the air that filled Sable Point after the north door began its irregular cycles of appearing, vanishing, opening, closing. At first, the sensation was indistinct, a background anxiety born of sleeplessness and the erosion of daily routine. But as the door's behavior grew more deliberate, its presence more pronounced, that tension matured into something sharper, an intelligence felt in the back of the skull, behind the eyes, inside the very cadence of my heartbeat. It was not just that the door opened and closed of its own volition, or that it seemed to migrate, splitting the geometry of the station in ways that confounded logic and memory. It was the feeling that the door was not the anomaly, but a threshold, an aperture maintained or animated by something that lingered just out of sight. I became convinced, though I struggled against the thought, that each time the door appeared, something on the other side was peering through. It was a watching that was patient, tireless, and utterly impersonal, like the gaze of a scientist regarding a specimen through glass or a predator waiting at the edge of a clearing. There was a physicality to it, a gravity that drew the eyes toward the seam, even when I told myself not to look. I noticed subtle cues before I would even see the door itself. A prickle at the nape of my neck, a tingling in my fingers, the inexplicable urge to turn and scan the corridor behind me as I moved through the station. The air would shift, growing denser and colder, the quality of the light dimming as though a storm were about to break. Sometimes the static on the comms panel changed, the white noise resolving for a moment into a frequency that sounded almost like breath, or the faint echo of words spoken just beyond comprehension. I started to avoid certain angles in the station, refusing to sit with my back to any corridor that might conceal the door, arranging my living space so that I could see as much of the interior as possible from a single vantage point. Even then, the sensation persisted, a tension that pulsed and receded, always returning, always centered on the places where the door had appeared. I attempted to rationalize this as paranoia, the consequence of prolonged isolation and disrupted sleep. I read through the psychological manuals provided for technicians' chapters on sleep hygiene, strategies for coping with sensory deprivation, warnings about the dangers of hallucination and obsession. I tried their methods, writing affirmations, setting rigid schedules, forcing myself through routines. None of it helped. The feeling of being watched was immune to reason, growing more acute with every passing day. Sometimes, in the shallowest part of night, I would whisper aloud to the empty room, asking if anyone or anything was there, and then flinch at the echo of my own voice as it was swallowed by the waiting silence. Evidence of the presence began to accumulate in ways both overt and subtle. I found objects displaced, sometimes only slightly a mug that had been set down on the control panel, now resting at the far end of the desk, a pair of gloves carefully laid out beside the north corridor, as if for inspection. The air would carry unfamiliar smells, wet earth, charred metal, a metallic tense that reminded me of blood or batteries. Once, I woke to find a pattern traced in condensation on the window nearest the north sector, a shape like an open eye, perfect and unbroken, fading as soon as I reached out to touch it. Another time, I caught sight of a shadow on the perimeter camera flicker, a suggestion of motion where there should have been only the blank white of snow. I rewound the footage again and again, unable to decide whether what I saw was real or a trick of failing equipment. Either way, the effect was the same. I became more vigilant, more isolated, drawn inward by the certainty that I was under observation. At night, my dreams turned violent and strange, filled with the sensation of being pulled through impossible spaces, hallways that bent and twisted in ways that defied physics, always ending at a door that waited for me, open and dark, with a cold light shining from beyond. I would wake in a panic, throat raw from shouting, convinced for a few breathless moments that I could hear footsteps outside my quarters, soft and deliberate, pausing just beyond the threshold. More than once I leaped from my bunk to check the corridor, only to find it empty, the door, when it appeared, silent and closed, as if nothing had ever happened. The dreams left an aftertaste, a residue of dread that clung to me through the day, shadowing even the most ordinary moments. I began to talk to the door when it appeared, half mocking, half pleading, as if some part of me believed it would answer. Sometimes I would sit in the corridor for hours, back against the opposite wall, staring at the seam and daring it to move. I explained myself out loud, described the station, the routines, the way things used to be before the door arrived, as if providing context would change its intentions. I told stories from my life before Sable Point, anecdotes I barely remembered, filling the air with the sound of my own voice to counteract the oppressive silence. The door, for its part, remained impassive, but the presence behind it seemed to thicken, coiling tighter, drawing nearer with every confession and every demand for explanation. In the absence of any response from Central or the outside world, I wondered if the door, what lay behind it, was learning from me, adapting, refining its tactics. The patterns of its appearance grew more complex, less predictable, as if testing my reactions, measuring my resilience. I recorded data, annotated every anomaly, constructed elaborate charts in the vain hope of uncovering a logic to its behavior. All I found was a kind of cruel playfulness. The door would manifest when I was most exhausted, vanish when I marshaled the nerve to confront it head-on, open just wide enough to reveal a sliver of darkness and then snap shut before I could cross the threshold. The more I tried to fight the sensation of being watched, the more I began to question my own actions. Was I performing for the presence, changing my routines in ways it anticipated? Did it want me to investigate or to retreat? Each choice became fraught, every action shadowed by the certainty that I was not the sole actor in this silent theater. There were moments brief, searing flashes when I thought I glimpsed something on the other side of the door, a shape, a movement, the glint of eyes in darkness. But always, by the time I blinked, these visions were gone, leaving only the echo of my own fear reverberating through the empty halls. Yet even as the sense of surveillance grew more oppressive, so too did my compulsion to understand, to witness, to record. I could no longer imagine a world in which the door did not exist, or in which I was not bound to its cycles of opening and closing, appearing and vanishing. The station had become a crucible, the locus of an experiment in which I was both subject and observer, actor and audience. And somewhere, just beyond the limits of sight and reason, the presence watched, patient and inscrutable, waiting for the moment when I would make the choice it required. I stopped pretending I was not afraid. The fear was an anchor now, proof that I still existed, that my perceptions had not yet been wholly colonized by whatever inhabited the far side of the door. I carried the fear with me as I walked the corridors, checked the cameras, logged each new disturbance. The station's walls had become thin, permeable, a membrane separating the world of men from something older and deeper and infinitely patient. And through it all, I was watched not with malice, not with kindness, but with the unblinking attention of a presence that needed nothing from me except, perhaps, for me to look back. The desire to wrest back control from the impossible took the shape of an investigation, methodical and feverish, a campaign to reclaim the territory of logic from the encroaching wilds of fear. There was a cold, defiant hope in the notion that if I could only assemble enough evidence, find the flaw in the steel, the forgotten patch in the blueprints, the overlooked notation in a maintenance log, then reality would snap back into its proper shape, and the north door would become just another explainable glitch in the station's indifferent machinery. I began with the blueprints once more, not trusting digital copies or the half-remembered layouts drifting in my head. I raided the station's archives, that metal filing cabinet in the locked equipment room, and retrieved the original sheaf of plans, blue-edged and yellowing at the corners, stamped and countersigned by names long since retired or dead. I spread them out on the galley table, anchoring the curling edges with coffee mugs and soup cans, tracing each wall and corridor, each hatch and vent, the entire anatomy of Sable Point rendered in lines and numbers and indifferent notations. The station's northern boundary was described in clinical, bureaucratic detail. Reinforced steel, 18 millimeters, bearing load. There was no mention of a passageway, no void space, no removable panel or emergency hatch. I examined each revision, each penciled correction, each faint erasure or ghost of a changed plan. If the door existed in these records, it was only as negative space, an absence more stark for its refusal to be acknowledged. I examined structural diagrams, maintenance overlays, fire safety, maps, nothing. Even the digital files, meticulously updated through years of rotation, contained no reference to an aperture or even a discontinuity in the wall's construction. It was as though the door had never existed, and yet it persisted, a real seam in my world. I became obsessed with measurement, approaching the north wall with calipers, a steel ruler, the stud finder tool from the emergency kit. I mapped the surface, marking points on a grid, comparing my results to the diagrams in the blueprints, searching for even the faintest inconsistency. The results were maddening. Every dimension matched the records to the millimeter. Every structural beam accounted for, every support bracket where it should be. The seam that marked the door's location was so perfect, so unaccountably straight, that I began to suspect some flaw in my tools. I recalibrated them, repeated the process, brought out the infrared thermometer and checked for temperature variation. The readings showed only a subtle dip in heat near the seam, a result I tried to explain away as a draft, a failure of insulation, anything other than what I suspected. I hammered gently along the wall, listening for hollows, waiting for the subtle change in resonance that would betray a cavity or false panel. The wall rang true, dense and solid, except at the precise line of the seam, where the sound flattened and deadened, as if striking something softer or deeper than steel. I documented all of this in my log, pages and pages of measurements and observations, annotated with mounting frustration. My days became consumed with this work, and my nights with a feverish replay of every test, every result, every failed attempt to draw a straight line between what I knew and what I could not explain. My hands began to tremble with exhaustion and cold, the old ache in my right wrist returning from a childhood injury long since forgotten. Each failure to find an answer only drove me deeper into the task, as if the sheer force of documentation could save me from whatever was seeping in from the other side. I tore the station apart, searching for hidden records. I checked every cabinet, every crawl space, every nook behind ceiling panels and floor tiles. I pulled up the grates in the utility corridors, scanned for loose boards, hidden latches, secret switches. Nothing. The station was as it had always been, except that it wasn't. And the north door stood as a silent refutation of every certainty I had ever relied upon. I even went outside again, circling the foundation in bitter wind and blinding snow, chipping at ice with a crowbar, seeking evidence of a patch or a hinge or even a scar in the paint. The external wall was seamless, unblemished save for the subtle depression in the snow that reappeared after every storm, a negative print that marked the place where the door met the world. It was at this point that I began to feel watched, not only by the presence behind the door, but by the station itself, as if the building resented my intrusion into its secrets. The lights in the corridor nearest the north wall flickered more often, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The comms panel emitted a low hum at odd intervals, the static resolving into fragments of sound snatches of my own voice, sometimes, or the echo of a message I had sent and received days before, cycling back at me with minor distortions. My dreams became more tangled, suffused with diagrams and measurements, the numbers on the blueprints morphing into runes that twisted away from my gaze. Still, I pressed on. I began to wonder if there might be records elsewhere at Central, in the archives of the construction contractors, in the digital logs stored in cloud servers I could no longer reach. I sent out queries, flagging them with the highest priority, attaching photos and logs and voice memos. I received only silence in return. The world beyond the station, once so ready to supply answers, or at least routine reassurances, was now an empty field. I imagined the servers full but unmanned, or else some faceless administrator reading my messages and deciding, for reasons of their own, to let the questions go unanswered. The sense of unreality grew. Sometimes, after hours spent immersed in blueprints and measurements, I would look up to find the corridor had changed shape, as if the very geometry of the station had become fluid. The north door would be there, then gone, then in a different place entirely, and my memory of its last appearance would be cloudy, stitched together by inference and dread. My own logs began to betray me, entries dated at impossible times, handwriting that did not seem to be my own. I began to doubt the fidelity of my senses, the integrity of my mind, and yet each test, each measurement, each re-examination of the structure left me with the same impossible conclusion. There was no evidence, no blueprint, no record of the door's existence. And yet the door was as real as the cold wind that rattled the eaves, as real as the fear that beat in my chest. I became certain, in those final days of investigation, that the north door was less a feature of the station than a rift in the world's order, a place where logic and history could be rewritten, denied, erased. It was a wound, a scar, an aperture, call it what you will, but it had become the most real thing in my life, more immediate and more urgent than the routines I had once relied upon. I stopped searching for evidence. I stopped believing in the blueprints, the maintenance logs, the tidy architecture of the past. All that remained was the door, its presence both proof and challenge, a question to which no answer would be permitted. And in that growing acceptance, I felt myself slip further from the world I had known, and deeper into the strange, watchful silence that waited on the other side. The station, once a fortress of order and routine, began to betray the subtle encroachments of something alien, something that reshaped the very fabric of the space I inhabited. The north door was no longer just a strange anomaly in the steel bulkhead, but the epicenter of unexplainable phenomena that chipped away at the walls of my sanity. The earliest disturbances were minor, almost laughable in their innocencer misplaced pen. A coffee mug shifted a few inches on the control panel. I blamed fatigue, my own carelessness, the vague disarray of a mind fraying at the edges. But the incidents escalated swiftly, turning from small oddities to events that could no longer be dismissed. One morning, I awoke to find the tools from my kit strewn across the galley floor in an arc that defied any logical pattern. The wrench lay balanced precariously on the edge of the sink. A single cup had been inverted, its contents long evaporated, and a notebook that I was certain had been closed and placed on a shelf now rested open, its pages fluttering as if caught by an unseen breath. I spent hours meticulously rearranging the mess, cataloguing the displaced items, searching for footprints or fingerprints in the thin dust that covered every surface. There were none. No sign that another human or even an animal had crossed the threshold. The only disturbance was the faint, lingering chill that hovered near the north wall, a cold that felt deeper than the ambient temperature, as if the air itself had been drained of warmth. That night, as the storm raged outside, the sounds began anew. At first, it was the low, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the station's hollow pipes, a cadence too deliberate to be natural, too erratic to be mechanical failure. I followed the noise to the corridor leading to the north door, flashlight in hand, heart pounding with every step. The beam caught a flicker at the edge of the seamer shadow, half-formed and wavering, as though the very darkness was pulsing with life. I blinked, and it was gone. The tapping ceased, replaced by a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a susurration of voices speaking in a language just beyond comprehension. I pressed my palm to the cold steel, listening for any variation in the hum of the station, but the silence was complete, save for the whispering that lingered in my mind long after I had returned to my quarters. Objects continued to move in inexplicable ways. Pens rolled off desks and landed upright on their caps. Chairs shifted slightly between my nightly checks. Loose papers were rearranged into crude patterns, geometric and unsettling, as though someone or something was attempting communication through the medium of disorder. I tried to capture these events on camera, setting up multiple devices to record the north corridor from different angles. The footage revealed nothing and only the play of shadows and the flicker of fluorescent lights, but reviewing it gave me a fleeting sense of control, a tether to reality amid the mounting chaos. Then came the shadows. I first noticed them peripherally, flickers at the corner of my vision, shapes that dissolved when confronted directly, but soon they gained substance and purpose. They moved against the walls, elongated and warped, following the corridor like living smoke, darting out from the seam and retreating with unnatural speed. I caught glimpses of forms, a silhouette that seemed humanoid but distorted, its edges blurred and shifting, a pair of eyes, luminous and unblinking, reflected in the cracked surface of a monitor. The shadows did not approach directly. They observed, probed, tested the boundaries of the station's interior and my own tolerance for the inexplicable. Their presence was an assault on the senses, a constant reminder that the door was not just a physical anomaly but a gateway to something beyond the ordinary. One night, as I sat by the control panel, the CUMS unit crackled with static, then resolved into a series of low, guttural sounds, like speech filtered through a distorted radio frequency. The voice was unintelligible but unmistakably intentional, a pattern of cadence and tone that stirred a primal fear in me. I attempted to respond, speaking into the microphone, but the line went dead, leaving only the echo of my own breath and the hum of failing electronics. The experience left me shaken, haunted by the sense that the station was no longer my domain, but a stage on which unseen actors rehearsed a drama. I could neither join nor escape. These unexplainable events culminated one evening in a moment of sheer terror. I had been monitoring the station's environmental controls when the power flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness broken only by the weak glow of emergency lighting. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. I heard the north door creak open, a grinding sound that reverberated through the metal corridors. With flashlight in hand, I approached cautiously, heart in my throat. As I neared, the shadows pooled around the threshold, coalescing into a figure that stepped through the door's widening gap. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its form shimmered as if it were made of smoke and shadow. The figure did not speak or move toward me, but simply stood there, observing. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away, feeling the full weight of its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissolved into mist, and the door slammed shut behind it. The station shuddered, the power returned, and the normal hum of the generator resumed. But the terror lingered, embedded in the walls and air, a permanent reminder that the north door was not just a door, it was a threshold, and beyond it lay something vast, unknowable, and utterly indifferent to my presence. My role had shifted irrevocably from caretaker to prisoner, trapped in a space where the rules no longer applied, and where the door opened and closed on a world I could glimpse but never enter. I stopped sleeping entirely, not because of insomnia, not because of stress or disorder, but because sleep had become synonymous with surrender. The door had made itself known not only through motion and misplacement, but through timing, through the uncanny precision with which it revealed its secrets at the edge of consciousness. When the world blurs and thought softens and judgments, it was then always then that things moved, that shadows stirred, that the air went still, as if the station itself had been switched to another frequency. I could not let that happen again. I had to remain awake, alert, fixed in place, like a sentinel at a gate that was never supposed to exist. And so I made preparations, fortified my mind with caffeine and noise, with harsh light and motion, anything to keep the slip from one state to another at bay. I dragged a chair down the corridor and placed it directly across from the north wall, so close I could hear the tick of my own pulse inside my ears and feel the hum of the reinforced bulkhead through the soles of my boots. I brought the tripod and camera with me, now outfitted with fresh batteries and redundancies for external drive, backup power cell, even a notebook in case something shorted again. I wasn't going to let the system fail this time. Wasn't going to leave anything undocumented, even if all I could capture was the whisper of presence or the flicker of light that refused to be measured. I turned off the hallway lights to reduce reflection, to make the darkness behind the seams stand out in sharp contrast, and then I sat down and began my vigil. The clock marked the hours in unfeeling increments, each minute passing like sediment settling in the bottom of a glass. Outside, the wind keened across the ridges and shook the old aerials until they groaned against their bolts, and the snow piled higher against the station walls with each gust. Inside, the silence folded in on itself, layered and alive. The corridor became a tunnel in time, a place where no day began and no night ended, only the steady passage of the breath, the blink, the beat, the eternal repetition of sensory input. At first, I tried to distract myself with small rituals, jotting notes every 5 minutes, counting tiles on the ceiling, reciting systems protocols aloud. But the monotony was a thin membrane, easily pierced. Eventually, all things circled back to the door. Around 0200 hours, the temperature dropped without warning. I checked the sensors. They reported no fault, no loss of heating, but I could see my breath fogging in the beam of the flashlight and feel the tremor in my fingers that wasn't fatigue. The metal of the north wall began to sweat, a thin condensation blooming like frost in reverse. I adjusted the focus of the camera, double-checked the red recording light, then leaned forward, narrowing my gaze. At first, the seam remained inert, nothing more than a line in steel. But as the minutes crept past, I saw it again, that near imperceptible distortion, as though the metal were breathing, flexing, responding. A tremor ran down the length of the bulkhead, subtle but unmistakable, and then the silence fractured. A sound low and resonant, like a bow drawn slowly across the string of a cello, rose from the far end of the corridor, not from any speaker or system I could trace, but from the very structure around me. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration in my teeth, in the cartilage of my ribs. I held my breath, and the door opened. It did not swing or slide, it peeled. The seam split with a wet, sinuous sound, and the center of the wall unzipped along a vertical axis that was not there seconds before. The camera blinked as if trying to compensate for an overload of contrast, and the light inside the aperture was not light at all. It was absence rendered visible a blackness, so dense it gave the illusion of texture, of depth without distance. I leaned forward, unblinking, afraid that if I looked away, even for a second, it would vanish again like all the other times. But it didn't. It remained open. And in that threshold I saw no shapes, no movement, nothing but that black, patient hunger that sat just past the veil of our world. Then something moved, not in the darkness, but at its edge. A ripple of shadow detached itself from the frame, not stepping forward, but unfolding, like a negative version of light blooming outward into our space. It had no face, no limbs, only suggestion-y, anthropomorphic gesture of presence. I could feel it regard me, not visually, not with eyes, but with the totality of its form, as if it were absorbing my essence in one slow, deliberate motion. I could not speak. My voice had vanished, my throat clamped shut by some ancient reflex. All I could do was stare as the figure, the placeholder for a figure, stood in that unnatural doorway. A silence within a silence, and then slowly began to recede. The door began to close as it had opened, the seam sealing from bottom to top, the walls knitting themselves back together as though nothing had ever been disrupted. I blinked, and the corridor was as it had always been. No sound, no cold, no trace of movement. But the camera was dark. I leaped to my feet and tore it from the tripod, scrubbing through the footage, desperate to find the moment of opening. But the file was corrupted, frozen, at 1 hour 59 minutes and 48 seconds. The remaining 10 minutes were lost. Overwritten with digital noise, black screen, red bars, a hiss that did not resolve into static but into the same frequency I had heard in my dreams. I pressed the play button again and again, eyes wide, hand trembling, but the recording was gone. My only proof had been erased by whatever rules governed the door's intrusion into this world. I returned to the chair, heart pounding, and sat for the rest of the night without moving, without recording, without even breathing hard, waiting to see if the door would open again. It didn't. Nothing stirred. But the station had changed. I could feel it in the way the air no longer echoed, in the way the lights no longer flickered but dimmed, as if aware that illumination was now a risk. The door was no longer a trick of stress or steel, no longer a curiosity or even a threat. It was a force, active and intelligent, and I had been seen. A threshold had been crossed not by me, but by whatever stood beyond the line of our understanding. When morning came, if such a term still applied, I made another log entry, this one less technical, more resigned. Observation complete. Door opened. Entity observed. Camera failed. Witnessed. I did not attempt to reach Central. I no longer believed they were listening. Or, if they were, I no longer believed they would or could intervene. This station, this outpost at the end of the world, had become something else. I was not watching anymore. I was being shown. And from that night forward, I knew the door did not require my permission to open. It happened on the 14th night of uninterrupted vigilance, a number I only confirmed later through the logbooks, because time had already begun to deform in the liminal space I now occupied. There were still moments where I tried to preserve the shell of routines, sipping at coffee long gone cold, ticking off tasks on a checklist whose contents no longer bore any connection to my circumstances, but the door had unraveled the hierarchy of my reality. It was no longer a question of whether it would open, or when, or even how. That boundary had eroded. What remained was inevitability. The question was no longer, will something come through? It was, what will I do when it does? And even that, I now understand, was naive. The moment had never been mine to define. The air in the station thickened well before the event. Not in temperature, which continued to hover just above freezing despite the generator's tireless hum, but in consistency. Movement felt submerged, as if I were pushing through some gelatinous atmosphere that clung to my limbs and dulled my reflexes. The lights dimmed not in wattage but in tone, their halogen white descending toward the sepia of old memory. The walls stopped echoing. I knew immediately, instinctively, that this was not a prelude to another glimpse or visitation, not another failed recording or whisper through the metal. This was culmination. I could feel it pressing outward from the seam, a silent pressure that didn't vibrate or rattle or groan but simply existed, undeniable, massive, and so still it made movement feel blasphemous. I didn't run, I didn't brace, I didn't even breathe. I stood at the end of the corridor and waited, my body at some midpoint between paralysis and invitation. The seam began to part, not as it had before with that wet organic unzipped, but cleanly and silently, as though it had always been a door and simply forgotten to act like one. It didn't open all at once. It widened slowly, two halves peeling apart without hinges or sound, revealing not darkness this time, but something stranger, a shimmer, like heat over asphalt, but vertical and vibrating, an aperture of compressed distortion that offered no perspective beyond, only the suggestion of shape and the unbearable sensation of being regarded from the other side by something that saw through all layers of pretense. There were no footsteps. There was no draft or pressure change, no musical sting of approaching horror. It simply emerged. It didn't step so much as extrude, like a concept made flesh, forced into the language of biology and time by proximity to my world. The figure was taller than I remembered from the previous glimpses, not because its physical height had changed, but because I now saw it clearly. It was not clothed, not naked, not anything that invited comparison to human anatomy. Its form was suggestion more than substance, a silhouette composed of oscillation, its edges vibrating at frequencies my mind strained to resolve. It had arms, or what passed for arms, and a head, or something like it, but the symmetry was all wrong. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe. It stood with the absolute stillness of something that had never been prey. My mouth opened involuntarily, a soft wheeze escaping before I could stop it, and in that instant, it turned its full attention upon me. The sensation was indescribable. Not pain, not terror, not even awe. It was total comprehension. It looked into me, not at me, and the layers of identity I thought I had constructed, name, age, memory, position, peeled away like dead skin. I was not examined, I was processed. Not maliciously, not kindly, just inevitably, the way a lens processes light, the way a scanner processes data. I fell to my knees without meaning to, the joints folding as though triggered by a command outside my control. I didn't feel afraid anymore, not in the way I had feared the door, the corridor, the dark. What I felt was a complete displacement from the order of things. I wasn't in the station. I wasn't in the North Corridor. I was nowhere, and the thing that had come through wasn't occupying space. It was space. It was definition. It was a rule of some higher geometry that had stepped into the room and politely declined to explain itself. My ears popped, not from pressure, but from whatever medium it displaced as it moved. And it did move, finally, forward one step, Then two. Each footfall silent, each advance shrinking the world around me. My heart did not beat. I checked later. The log showed no pulse for exactly 37 seconds, as if time itself had waited. I remember the way the station changed in its presence, how the lights flickered not from electricity, but from confusion. The walls seemed to breathe inward. The corners folded. The seams of the world twisted slightly, like a camera lens focusing wrong, and then worse, and then impossibly worse. And then it reached me. It didn't touch me, but I felt its presence within my body, like a thought I'd never had but remembered perfectly. My memories unraveled in reverse: childhood, adolescence, arrival at the station. The first time I saw the door pulled upward like fibers from wet paper and held for inspection. I saw them. It showed me. Not just my memories, but other things I could not have known. Images of cities buried in ash, of skies flickering with impossible constellations, of languages shaped in gas and resonance, of machines thinking in dreams, of lives behind veils, always behind veils. I saw the door as it truly was, not a creation, but a permission, a valve, a point of pressure in the skin of reality that had finally given way because I had been still long enough and quiet, long enough and hollow enough to open it. And then it passed me. It walked toward whatever the closest approximation was through the corridor, through the hall, not bound by the constraints of structure or perception. I turned my head to follow it, my neck aching from a posture I had not realized I'd held, and I watched it step past the boundaries of the station's layout into a place that should have been a supply closet, and vanish into a gradient of impossible color, like a bruise shifting under skin. The door sealed itself in its wake, this time not as a seam, not as a physical boundary, but as an absence of possibility. I ran my hands along the wall where it had been. Nothing, no line, no chill, no resistance, just smooth, indifferent metal. I collapsed there, against the cold, against the knowledge, and I wept not from fear, not even from relief, but from the terrible truth of it. There would be no record, no footage, no broadcast, no trace. I was the record. I was the witness. And whatever had come through had not done so with purpose or intention. It had simply been allowed, and I had simply been present. I remained in that spot until the lights returned to their original tone, until the air grew warm again, until my heart remembered its rhythm. And even then, I did not rise. The station was quiet again, obedient, cold, and empty, but I was not. Something had looked into me, and in doing so, had left behind the knowledge that I was not alone, not ever, not really. The north door was gone, but it had left its echo in me, not a haunting, a blueprint, a promise. And somewhere behind the steel, behind the walls and the snow and the sky, something now knew my name. It didn't happen all at once. The unraveling was slow, almost imperceptible. Like a drip in the ceiling, you tell yourself you'll patch tomorrow, until one morning you wake to find the floor submerged. I told myself I was fine. I told myself what I had witnessed could be compartmentalized. STORED, neatly in a corner of memory labeled exception or hallucination or momentary lapse. But those labels peeled off quickly, and what remained was not a clean narrative or a rational reconstruction of events. What remained was a rotting seam in my thoughts, something I could feel whenever I closed my eyes, a line splitting down the middle of memory and dream, slicing open the quiet architecture of my selfhood and letting the cold pour in. At first I tried to continue my duties. I wrote daily logs. I checked the systems. I inventoried supplies. But the words on the screen didn't hold shape. I would type entire paragraphs only to realize, moments later, that I couldn't remember what I'd written or why. Whole entries disappeared from the database, overwritten by strings of characters I didn't recognize, gibberish that looked like fragments of languages I didn't speak. or hadn't spoken in years, or hadn't spoken at all. I began to doubt the reliability of my own hands. I found notes I didn't recall writing, lists in my handwriting that detailed dreams I hadn't had or events that hadn't happened as they had, and I'd simply misplaced them among the noise. Time fractured. The clocks inside the station desynchronized slowly, then all at once, the wall chronometers fell out of sync with the computer logs. My wristwatch stopped altogether, ticking only when I held it up to the North Corridor, as though proximity to that place reactivated something latent in its gears. I began waking up in strange positions, standing in the control room, holding a dismantled radio. Once seated at the galley table, with the power completely off, a single emergency candle burned down to a stump beside my hand. On several occasions, I found the lights already on when I woke, the systems already active, meals already half prepared, as though some version of me had begun the day hours before I caught up with him. I started hearing voices, not loud or distinct or even verbal, but the sensation of language, pressed against the inside of my skull like a hand over the mouth of a scream. They were not instructions, they were not questions, they were presence, tone, emotion without grammar, meaning without syntax, a whisper in the structure of my thoughts that did not belong to me. They never identified themselves, and I never heard them in any direction. They came from the very act of thinking. They were woven into the folds of cognition itself, like parasites of awareness. I tried to record them, to reproduce the sensation, but each time I pressed record, the sensation ceased, as though observation disrupted their waveform. My dreams became windows, not symbolic, not metaphor, literal. I dreamed I was watching myself walk through the corridor from the perspective of the door. I saw the back of my head, the way I tilted slightly to the right when I walked, the way I scratched my temple when I turned toward the comms panel. The perspective was wrong, too high, too still. I dreamed of vast underground chambers where machines thought in pulses of light and shadow. I dreamed of faceless cities built from mirrors. I dreamed of myself standing on the far side of the door, watching me sleep. The worst dream, the one I didn't write down until days later, was of my own voice repeating the same message into the comms panel over and over, pleading for help in a tone of resignation so quiet it barely qualified as sound. And in the dream, I wasn't broadcasting it, I was receiving it. I began to forget words, common ones, simple ones. I stood in front of the sink, trying to remember what it was called. I stared at the bed and couldn't name the sheets. I tried to write the word station in my log and found myself unsure if it had one T or two. Language itself had begun to thin, to dissolve into implication and gesture. I began keeping a separate journal log of forgettings, cataloguing each lost word, each misplaced concept. But the journal kept disappearing, only to reappear days later in a different drawer, with new entries in my handwriting I had no memory of making. The fear became its own rhythm, not sharp, not sudden. A long, slow heartbeat beneath everything, like the drone of the generator or the wind's hollow voice outside the siding. The fear wasn't of the door anymore. The door had done what it came to do. It had introduced me. The fear was of myself, of what I had become, of what I might yet become. I could feel myself thinning, not physically. My body remained stubbornly intact, though I had grown pale and row-boned, my eyes ringed with sleepless days. No, the thinning was in the self-like, a transparency laid over some deeper pattern. I no longer responded to my name with immediacy. I no longer recognized my voice on recordings. I no longer believed the reflection in the mirror belonged only to me. I began to wonder if I had ever left the corridor, if I had ever returned from the moment the entity stepped through, if the closing of the door had not marked the end of a visitation but the beginning of something permanent. I searched the logs for continuity, but found gaps, blackouts, overlapping timestamps. I compared photographs of the same corner of the station, taken only days apart, and saw small differences, scratches that weren't there before, stains in places I didn't recognize, markings in the frost that resembled characters but melted before I could trace them. My own handwriting began to vary subtly across pages, as though I were becoming several people living in staggered time, all using the same body. I attempted to reassert control. I set alarms at regular intervals, forcing myself to record videos every hour, asking questions into the camera that only I should know the answers to. But when I played them back, my responses were hollow, distracted. Once, I watched a recording of myself staring into the lens for 5 full minutes without blinking, mouth slightly ajar, whispering the phrase "not yet" over and over. I had no memory of filming it. I erased the file, then found it again in a different folder with a new timestamp. I tried to delete it again. It reappeared. There were moments of clarity, brief crystalline flashes in which I knew myself again, in which I tasted coffee and remembered my mother's laugh and the color of autumn leaves in the park outside the lab. But these moments faded like dreams, and the clarity left behind a hollow ache, like the body's grief for something it cannot name. I began to suspect that the station had never been real, or that it had once been real but now existed only as a frame for the thing on the other side of the door. Maybe it had always been a machine, not for observation or research, but for transformation, a cocoon, a prism, a crucible in which identity was melted down and reformed into something new, something receptive. And still, every morning, I walked the corridor. I touched the place where the door had been. I whispered questions into the seamless steel. Sometimes I heard nothing. Sometimes I heard my own voice replying from deep within the walls. And sometimes I heard laughter, quiet, patient, echoing in the corners of thought like a memory from before I was born. There is a kind of desperation that arises not from isolation itself, but from the certainty that something, some presence, some will's near, and yet utterly unreachable. I no longer feared solitude. I had passed through that narrow, frantic corridor weeks ago, or what felt like weeks, though time had long since abandoned its familiar cadence. What haunted me now was the closeness of something intelligent and indifferent, or worse, aware but uninterested, something that had spoken to me once, not in language but in essence, and then gone silent, as if satisfied with the encounter, or as if the transmission had been one way. I became obsessed with the idea of establishing contact, not because I wanted answers, not anymore. What I wanted was proof that I was not merely decaying in a vacuum of my own design, proof that what had stepped through the north door had left more than a wound in my mind. I needed to know if I could reach it, and if it would reach back. I began with the CUMS system, my oldest and most familiar tool. I cycled through every available frequency, both official and obsolete, reprogramming the bandwidth allocations to sweep slowly through a range far broader than the parameters allowed. The signal analyzer hissed with dead static for hours at a time, occasionally spitting back fragments of old broadcasts caught in the ionosphere, weather reports from stations long decommissioned, garbled news headlines from distant continents, and once, terrifyingly, my own voice reading out system diagnostics from a log I had never recorded. I tried to engage it, speaking into the mic with questions, simple and complex. Questions about the entity, about the door, about myself. Sometimes I begged, sometimes I screamed, sometimes I wept quietly as I asked, over and over, whether anyone could hear me. I began logging each attempt like a ritual, detailing the frequency, the message, the ambient temperature, the time, if such a thing still existed, of the transmission. The records filled entire notebooks, scrawled in increasingly erratic handwriting, but the replies, if there were any, remained elusive. Sometimes I thought I caught a pattern in the static, a pulse or harmonic loop that hinted at encoded meaning, but by the time I isolated it, it would vanish again, like breath on glass. I turned to physical media. I began writing letters, not to anyone in particular, sometimes too central, sometimes to the entity, sometimes to myself. I wrote about the station, about the day the door appeared, about the feeling of being watched and the long unraveling of memory. I wrote questions I had no intention of answering and confessions I didn't remember making. I slipped these letters under the north wall where the seam had once been, or where it sometimes reappeared when the air grew too still. I stacked them like offerings. I burned them in the galley stove. I hid them inside the crawl spaces, whispering the words aloud as I folded them. Sometimes, when I checked later, they were gone. Other times, they were returned, rearranged, marked with tiny slashes or symbols I didn't recognize but began to catalogue obsessively, convinced that they formed a language I had not yet learned to decipher. I tried drawing, symbols, diagrams, fractals that spiraled inward, toward a center I could never quite define. My hands moved faster than I could follow, drawing shapes I didn't plan and couldn't replicate. Once I filled an entire wall of the eastern storage room with interlocking sigils, only to return the next day and find the wall bare, scrubbed clean as though freshly painted. The markers I'd used sat neatly on the ground in a row, uncapped but full, their tips pristine. I checked the camera feed and found only hours of blank footage, the frame frozen on a single empty shot of the room, undisturbed. I began to suspect the station itself was filtering what could be recorded, editing the archive to protect the reality it had absorbed. I started sketching directly into the margins of the paper logs instead, hoping to hide my messages in plain sight, beneath the weight of protocol. Eventually, I turned to sound. I built makeshift instruments from scraps, copper pipe chimes, a small harp of stretched wire, a drum made from the sealed edge of an old food container. I played them in patterns, repeating rhythms that came to me in dreams or in the moments just before waking. I recorded the sounds, replayed them in loops near the north wall, modulated the frequencies to create harmonic feedback, attempting to mimic the tonal sensation I'd experienced during the entity's approach. Sometimes the station seemed to respond. A light would flicker in rhythm, a panel would hum sympathetically, a door would slide open just before the sequence ended, but nothing ever crossed through, nothing ever replied. The more I tried, the more apparent it became that communication, in the way I understood it, was a closed loop. I could transmit endlessly, pour my mind into every corner of the station, encode my consciousness into sound and structure and pattern, but I was never certain if anything on the other side was even listening, let alone capable of understanding. The entity had not spoken. It had known, and knowing, perhaps, was all it needed. I, on the other hand, was still bound by language, still dragging my questions through channels that had no receivers, like throwing stones into a vacuum and waiting for an echo. It became a ritual in itself. Wake, broadcast, record, write, burn, repeat. I spoke less to myself now. I whispered instead. Whispered into vents, into the drain in the floor, into the duct above my bed. I began to sense that the station was listening, not the entity, but the structure, the steel and circuits and wiring, the accumulated memory of habitation. The station became a kind of ghost, reflecting my words back at me in subsonic delays, reshaping my voice into strange harmonics that reverberated behind me seconds after I stopped speaking. I would turn, startled, expecting a response, and hear only the echo of what I had not meant to say. I stopped trusting the recordings. I stopped trusting the logs. I began to suspect that I was communicating, after all, just not as the originator of the message. Sometimes I would wake to find new logs written in the system, detailing broadcasts I hadn't made, messages I hadn't composed. One read, "Do not come through. You are not prepared." Another, days later, "We are already here. You opened it." And another still, "This is not a door. This is a mirror." I deleted them. They reappeared. I wiped the drive. They migrated. Eventually, I let them stay, a growing archive of transmissions from an author that shared my name, my credentials, my voice, but not my memory. In my final days of attempted communication, though I didn't know they were final at the time, I sat in the corridor across from the north wall and read aloud everything I had written since the door first appeared. I did it without pause, without correction, for hours. I spoke until my voice cracked and my throat burned. I read through the night, pages soaked in sweat and ink, tears and blood from where I'd torn my fingertips turning too quickly. I ended with a single line, repeated until the words lost meaning. "Tell me if I'm still here." The corridor remained quiet. The door did not appear. But the next morning, I found the pages stacked neatly beside my bunk, their ink rearranged into a spiral. At the center, a single word I do not remember writing and cannot now reproduce. I tried to draw it. I forgot it immediately, but I understood what it meant. Not an answer, not a warning, not even an acknowledgement. Just a point of contact, a fingertip pressed briefly against glass. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The futility of reaching out was not because no one was listening. It was because I was not yet the kind of thing that could be answered. I no longer remember when I stopped fearing the door and started fearing what had come before it. What I had been, what I had believed, what I had insisted was the shape and boundary of the world. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for the loss of certainty, an erosion so complete that it unmoors not just your beliefs, but the very scaffolding of perception. I began to understand that the door was not an intrusion into my reality, but a correction to it. Not a hole torn in the fabric of this place, but a repair, a reassertion of something older than thought and deeper than comprehension. It had not appeared by accident, and it had not been created by me. It had waited, and I had opened it. Not with keys, not with tools, not even with intention. I had opened it by watching, by listening, by enduring, by being here long enough and hollow enough and desperate enough to loosen the lock between one state of being and another. There had been no real moment of decision. There had been only slow accumulation, the weight of silence, the repetition of protocol, the wearing down of the mind beneath the relentless geometry of solitude. I had become porous, not broken, not defective, just increasingly less bound by the assumptions I had once called reason. The station had watched this happen, or perhaps it had facilitated it. And when the moment came, when the air changed and the seam widened and the things stepped through, it had not been a rupture, it had been a fulfillment. The last days again, I use days only because I lack another word for the passage of shadow and motion, were marked by clarity, not confusion. I could no longer maintain the fiction that I was here in service to anything but the door. The tasks fell away. The logs stopped. The alerts and alarms and system checks continued to ping and flash and chirp, but I no longer responded. The station operated itself. It had always done so, if I was honest. My presence had been tolerated, perhaps necessary in the way a catalyst is necessary to trigger a change. But I was no longer the point. The door was, and the change was complete. I spent hours, then what might have been days, seated before the north wall, which no longer bore any trace of the seam. It had become smooth again, indifferent, the way a scar flattens into skin. I stared at it, not because I expected it to open, but because I had begun to suspect that it had never truly closed, that perhaps the door was not a physical construct at all, but a condition of mind, a point of access that followed me through the station, through time, through thought. The air vibrated differently now, not constantly, not loudly, but with an ambient frequency like a breath held in the chest of the universe. I could feel it when I moved, when I slept, when I stood perfectly still. The station had become part of it, or I had. The logs I had once trusted were no longer accessible. The files refused to open, or else displayed blank entries with time stamps that ran backwards, into the negative, into the abstract. I found handwritten notes in drawers and panels and compartments I had never opened, bearing not my handwriting but familiar phrasing. Some were diagrams, spiral constructions of line and symbol that made my head ache when I tried to study them. Others were warnings. Don't look at it too long. Do not follow it. It can't lie, but it doesn't speak. And always, always, the door was never meant to be opened. I wanted to know who had written these, when and why and how, but every line felt as though it had been written by the station itself, transcribed through the hands of those who had come before me, or perhaps through the hands I had forgotten were my own. I remembered now, or thought I did, the day I first arrived. The snow had been shallower then, the sky brighter. The interior of the station had smelled of plastic and dust, the way all untouched systems do. But I remembered also the unease, the way the wind curved strangely around the north corner, the way the air seemed to dense when I passed the end of that corridor. Had the door been waiting then? Had I seen it without knowing, sensed it without believing? I played old recordings of myself greeting messages, routine reports, maintenance updates, and found them subtly altered, my voice flatter, my words arranged with the rhythm of someone trying to remember how sentences worked. I no longer trusted the recordings, but I no longer trusted memory either. I began to suspect that memory was never the right kind of tool to understand what the door was, only the raw material it fed upon. I had seen it open, I had seen something come through, and then I had seen myself, not in mirrors, in dreams, in reflections on the dark glass of the monitor, in the brief doubling of footsteps behind me. I had seen myself walking the corridor just after I left it, turning corners just before I did. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that I had finally split under the strain. But these echoes, these twins, did not behave like illusions. They avoided me, slipped away just before contact, left behind subtle distortions in the air. I began to think that I had become unbound, that my proximity to the door had allowed something to copy me, or divide me, or unfold me into something multi-layered, that perhaps I was now both observer and observed, that I had become part of the pattern. I stopped following these echoes. I began to feel that their destination was not different than mine, only staggered in time, a queue of selves approaching the same terminal. On what I believed to be the final night, I sat at the galley table and tried to write a message to anyone who might come after. I wanted to say something simple, something whole, but the words failed me. I could write only fragments. The door was never meant to be opened. It doesn't come through. You go in, there is no return, but there is movement. It sees you from the inside out. Memory is the first to go, but language is next. If you feel the air go still, don't speak, don't blink, don't turn around unless you are certain the corridor is empty. The door feeds on narrative. Don't give it a story. I folded these lines into a note and placed it beneath the north wall. The wall did not respond, but I had the sense it had been received. I slept that night without dreams, or if I dreamed, I did not remember them. When I woke, the station was silent, powered down. No hum from the generator, no lights, no pings. The cold had returned, but it no longer hurt. I stood and walked the corridor, knowing I would find the door again, not as seam or threshold or opening, but as a presence. And I did. The air folded, the wall became thin, and I stepped through. There was no sound, no tunnel, no descent. There was only an inversion, a quiet, a pause in thought like the last beat before sleep. And then I was elsewhere, or else I was myself, but changed, adapted to a language without form. I do not know if I still inhabit flesh. I do not know if I still write. But I remember the cold. I remember the station. I remember the door. And I remember the understanding that came with it. It was never meant to be opened, but once opened, it cannot be closed. Not completely. Not from this side.